What is not a solvable problem is the belief that the existence of a Jewish state anywhere in the Middle East is a crime and has to be eliminated.
Shalom and welcome back to the State of a Nation podcast. I'm Israeli spokesman Eylon Levy. Across the globe, societies celebrate moments that define them, from spontaneous joy in New York after a World Series victory to choreographed Independence Day parades. These festivities are a window into a society's soul. On Diwali, Hindus celebrate the triumph of light over darkness. On Dia de Muertos, Mexicans honor their dead ancestors. So how do we explain the celebrations on October 7th? When the massacre unfolded, we in Israel were horrified by the atrocities, and we were also horrified by the outburst of jubilation in Gaza and around the world. Gazans who called it the best day of their lives, crowds cheering as hostages were paraded through the streets, handing out candy, honking in jubilation. What exactly were they celebrating? What did they think was about to happen? It wasn't just Gaza. That joy spread around the world. The professor at Cornell who called it exhilarating. The student radicals who adopted paragliders used by Hamas death squads as their symbol. What were they thinking? My guest today on State of a Nation is Shany Mor, a lecturer in political thought at Reichman University here in Israel. In his groundbreaking essay, Ecstasy and Amnesia in Palestine, published in Mosaic magazine, he zooms out to help us understand this moment more clearly. It turns out there's a historical pattern, one that's played out 3 times before, and October 7th was number 4. Historically, Arab attacks on Israel have been greeted with jubilation before a humiliating defeat, and then a rewriting of history as the losing side forgets why there was a war in the first place. Time and again, the Palestinians are cast as eternal victims, stripped of agency or responsibility, and we get dragged into another cycle of violence as they repeat the mistakes of the past. What were they thinking? It's a question that's been on my mind as we witness the destruction that Hamas has brought onto Gaza by starting this war and by fighting this war, hiding behind and under civilians. And it's a question I'm thinking about as we look ahead to the day after Hamas and ask how we stop this cycle of violence. In today's episode, we're going to look at the launch of the October 7 war in its bigger historical context. Because it turns out October 7th is part of a vicious cycle we've seen before. A cycle of ecstasy and amnesia. On with the show.
We have breaking news out of Israel this morning.
Shocking hostage.
Hundreds of Israelis are dead.
I want to bring in Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy.
What happens when the 4-day pause ends?
Where does this go?
The actions of Israel have gone beyond.
Shany Mor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Are we going by Dr. Mor or Shany?
I think we can do first names.
First names.
Yeah.
Shany, I'll start with the most difficult question that anyone in Israel gets asked nowadays. How are you?
I'm fine. You know, in a weird way, we kind of entered into a really bizarre normality. Obviously, that would be very different if I was from a southern community or, heaven forbid, connected directly. I guess I'm one of the more fortunate people in this country. I only had to go to one funeral in the immediate aftermath of October 7th of a student of mine. And once things began to reopen in November and the rocket fire died down, there was a certain weird and frightening normality to the whole thing. I hope we get over this.
We'll get over it, but it's always been part of our country's story, that never-ending attempt to try to find normality in the most abnormal circumstances.
Well, I lived through something like this before, which was the normality of the Second Intifada. There was something deeply shocking about it initially, and then life wrapped around it, to the point where I didn't think I would ever see it go away. Near the end of the Second Intifada, I went to graduate school in New York. And I remember the first time entering a cafe and there not being a security guard and feeling very vulnerable in a cafe in New York. And I asked an Israeli friend of mine, I saw the Philharmonic in the park, in Central Park. And I said, and there was no security, of course. And I said to him, do you think that we will ever go to a cultural event in the park in Tel Aviv or in Jerusalem without security, or will they end up being like us? And he said, obviously, they're going to end up being like us. And he was wrong, and it's amazing, but there was no way we could have known that then.
You say that's wrong, but with the amount of security that's been stepped up, at least around Jewish sites in the diaspora, not too far off with that prediction.
That's for sure. But when I returned to Israel in 2006, 3 years after having left, I couldn't believe how much the things that I thought were permanent in the middle of the Second Intifada were not permanent at all. It took some time for us to realize that it was over. There was no victory parade. There was no signing of a ceasefire, much less an unconditional surrender. But it ended. It passed.
And that's one of the biggest challenges, really, of telling Israel's story at this time, that we become accustomed to a reality that is so messed up and not normal, and have to keep conveying that outrage and shock because what we're going through is not obvious. Shany, I want to take you back to October 7th, when the massacre unfolded. Everyone around the world, let's not everyone, a lot of people were shocked. But you had a sense of déjà vu. What did you see?
I had spent about 3 years leading up to that time thinking a lot about how we, the Israelis and Palestinians, or Israel and its immediate neighbors perhaps, were almost certainly descending into another pointless war. And I tried to write about this a bit in several points. I wrote a lot about some of the mistakes that I thought that were being made by our side of this conflict. And I tried to write a bit about some of the tragic mistakes that were being made by the other side. The thing that, I mean, the real turning point for me, I should say, in thinking about this wasn't events on the ground. It was kind of, and this is my own bias as an observer, it was more intellectual events. And it was particularly around 2021, I think. I mean, these were thoughts I started having in 2020, but around 2021, looking at the state of ideas in the larger self-styled pro-Palestinian community.
You were getting this
world.
premonition that there was another conflict coming, and then when October 7th happened, what was it that you said, right, the writing here was on the wall? Well,
because I had tried to think about the situation of the Palestinians specifically, not just of the Israelis or of the Arabs in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but what the Palestinian predicament was by the 2020s. And I soon realized that, something like 90% of this very, very complicated situation and this very unfortunate situation that the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause found itself in was the outcome of 3 wars. 3 wars that were radically different from each other in almost every way, in terms of the belligerent parties in the war, in terms of their duration, in terms of the style of combat, and yet they had essentially completely created the predicament. The predicament of the Palestinian people was not just nationhood without statelessness. That in itself, by the way, is a terrible predicament to be in. It was a combination of nationhood and statelessness together with displacement, occupation, and fragmentation. The latter 3 being the outcomes of 3 Arab-Israeli wars that began in 1947.
The 3 wars being?
The war that began in 1947. The one
War
that began
of Independence?
The one that began in 1967.
The Six-Day War?
And the one that began in 2000.
Namely the Second Intifada.
Right. Now, you'll notice that each of these wars actually, they seemingly have nothing in common. One is a civil war and then a multi-state war that lasts over a year. One is a very rapid 3-front war between 4 armies that takes place over less than a week. And
6 days, to be precise.
Yeah. And one is something of both a terrorist campaign, a counterinsurgency, and
what is the connecting line that you're identifying between these 3 wars that makes you say, I think we're seeing the same pattern in action?
Well, there's a couple things that connect them. The one huge thing that connects all 3 of these wars, despite their massive differences in terms of the participants and the duration and everything about them, was that the lead up to the war was a period of intense jubilation and excitement, almost ecstasy about the upcoming.
Leading up to the wars, not the first days necessarily. This was the build-up.
And even the first day or 2, depending on which war we're talking about. A real excitement about the violence to come. Not just about the conflict, an excitement about the violence itself. a fantasy about the revenge that it was going to bring, the honor that it was going to bring, and the purification that the violence would bring.
But these wars weren't sort of didn't erupt suddenly out of nowhere. There was this build-up with this expectation of on the Arab side, the achievement of what a glorious war aims through extreme violence.
Yes. Secondly, that they ended in terrible defeat. That the defeat, regardless of who the belligerent parties were on the Arab side, that the defeat was hugely costly for the Palestinians, even, for example, in 1967, where they aren't really a party to the war at all, and in 1948, where they're not the drivers of it.
Jubilation, and then defeat, a terrible defeat for the Arabs, and then the critical part.
A complete amnesia.
Amnesia.
And a fundamental effacing of not just what the war was about, but about the fact that there even was a war. A replacement of a war story with one of pure victimization, where defeat in war becomes a kind of moral victory.
Let me try to take this down into terms that many people will be familiar with what the Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, the displacement of Arab Palestinians in the 1948 war, which of course created displacement on both sides. Many Jews were also forced to flee into the borders of what became the State of Israel. But that narrative of victimhood and displacement, that wasn't how the narrative began, was it?
No, far from it. The word Nakba, when it was coined in this context, was a description of the colossal Arab defeat. And you'll notice
military defeat.
Yeah, you'll notice two words in there that disappear over the decades: Arab and defeat. It was
in a war that the Arabs had jointly launched,
in a war that
and then suffered an extreme setback when they were beaten by those pesky little Jews.
A war, by the way, that it shouldn't be difficult for us to say, and it wasn't difficult for most observers to say, certainly most liberals and progressives in 1948, a war that was an entirely immoral war in both its ends and its means. A war whose goals were suffused by all the things that today we claim to condemn.
Such as
racism, imperialism, and of course anti-Semitism. It was a war that was fought to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state in a tiny part of the Middle East, a war that everywhere where it could targeted Jews as Jews for death and expulsion, with no exceptions, and a war that was excitedly, jubilantly celebrated as such.
And that really is the point, because what traumatized a lot of Israelis on October 7th was not just the atrocities that Hamas perpetrated, but seeing the genuine jubilation as those hostages were paraded through the streets of Gaza, jubilation on Western streets as well, but also inside Gaza, that the sheer glee that many of the people now taking to social media inside Gaza, complaining about the very difficult living conditions there, were celebrating October 7th as the best day of their lives. And you're saying that's a pattern that we've seen recurring throughout history with the three previous wars: War of Independence, Six-Day War, the Intifada. What follows that in your historical analysis is defeat and then amnesia.
That's right. The reason why I started seeing this happening in 2020 and 2021 was because of another thing that was common to these three wars. By the way, I'll add the one other thing that maybe we won't expand on in this discussion. One thing that was common to these three wars that was different from other Arab-Israeli wars was the centrality of Jerusalem, which I thought was an interesting thing. In my article, I don't try to explain it too much because I didn't, and I still don't.
But if we get back to October 7th.
There was a third thing, I think, that united those previous three wars, was that the anti-Israel cause was subsumed a bit imperfectly into a larger global cause. It fit on a global fissure, and the cause of an Arab Palestine was sort of the spearhead of a larger losing global cause.
That's interesting, and I want to unpack that thought in just a little bit. But if we zoom back specifically on what happened on October 7th, you really have to ask yourself, did these people who were experiencing this moment of jubilation and celebration as the massacre unfolded and the hostages were brought back into Gaza not understand where this was going? Did they not see what was coming next? Could they not see that Hamas was dragging them into a pointless and totally needless war that they would inevitably lose in the face of Israel's preponderant military power?
I don't think that they believed they were going to lose. I still don't think.
What do you think they thought was going to happen? Really, what did they think was going to happen?
Well, let's separate. I mean, I think your question is about, and it would be on something I know much less about, and maybe that I'm not sure is important. I think your question is about kind of assholes on social media, basically. And, you know, there's a pathological element in every society. And I can't... I'm not sure that that's as interesting.
I don't think... Because it's not only the question of people on social media celebrating the atrocities. I just saw an illuminating Doha Institute poll suggesting that among West Bank Palestinians, 0% would call the October 7 attacks illegitimate. The large majority think this was a, quote, legitimate act of resistance. How do you explain that? How do you explain that genuine embrace and jubilation before we unpack the rest of the patterns?
I'll tell you how I don't explain it. I don't explain it just because of whatever anyone has suffered under Israel, and I'll tell you why. Because the West Bank stat in the poll that you cite is not actually different from the statistic in any other Arab country. In other words, the
others are 2-3% maybe say it's illegitimate, but not
overwhelmingly something like 80% country after country after country support the operation that was carried out against Israel on October 7th. And these are places that have never lived a day under any Israeli occupation, never gone through an Israeli checkpoint, never any of the silly excuses we make for this kind of stuff. This attack was a kinetic expression of a deeply held ideological and theological movement in the Arab world that
ideological movement being
that Israel is a criminal entity, that its existence is an affront to all that is good and just and right in the world, an affront to Arab honor, and that it will someday disappear.
And is that what you see as the dividing thread between this recurring pattern within Arab history of jubilation and ecstasy in the lead up to a war that leads to a terrible disaster, and then forgetting the initial jubilation and sinking into a victim narrative? That belief that Israel is an affront to Arab honor and will eventually be wiped out?
Yeah, and I think the sinking into a victim narrative is how you keep repeating the mistake. Because it's one thing to look at a military setback the way we did after 1973, the way we are going to do right now after our own failures on the 7th of October in 2023, and try to learn lessons from it.
Because we as a society are going to have to engage in a very serious lessons learned process to unpack how this disaster happened to us.
But if you're just a victim, if actually you leave the theater of battle with a moral victory,
then you don't take responsibility.
And there's no lesson to be learned.
And then no practical lessons that can be learned on the Palestinian side in the way that we would hope to then learn lessons and put them into practice to try to escape the same cycle of launching pointless wars, losing them, and then claiming a victim narrative.
Look, again, I want to go away from horrible people on social media. What one was seeing in the sort of intellectual class, people who were publishing articles in English in the leading journals, leading opinion journals and policy journals in the West, people in the
lead up to October 7th?
In the lead up in the last 3 years.
What were we seeing within the intellectual circles?
A real mobilization behind the idea that not just Israel could be forced to withdraw from the West Bank and make concessions on Gaza, but that Israel itself was somehow doomed, that its very existence as a Jewish state was both a crime and something that had no real long-term life expectancy. And there was a real misreading, by the way, of the events in May of 2021, particularly the intracommunal violence in Israel, and a real growing intellectual mobilization throughout progressive circles in the West behind the idea that Israel's entire essence was something that was not really sustainable, probably, and had a limited shelf life.
And perhaps that is why they thought that the October 7 massacre would lead Israel to fall apart or be pushed over instead of leading to that same narrative. Shany, I'm interested that you talk about what was being written in intellectual circles, specifically in English, because we've seen a lot of support for Palestinians have become, call it the mascot, the center of the rallying cry of progressives, a certain radical movement around the world. And you write in your illuminating essay, I like this line, Palestine has served as an excellent rallying cry for others. For Palestinians, the result has never been good. So I'm wondering how you see, given the mobilization in Western campuses, particularly on Western streets for the cause of the Palestinians, are they being helped by this, or is this trapping them in a pernicious narrative?
Look, it's not for me as an Israeli to make a definitive assessment of that.
But I'm wondering, as an academic who's also spent time on these campuses, how you see that movement connecting with what is happening on the ground. How do they connect?
I don't think that the cause that's motivating this passion is anything special about the Palestinians. It's when we call it the Palestinian cause, we're not actually being honest about what's mobilizing it. It's the anti-Israel cause. And the anti-Israel cause, in all of its mania and in all of its obsessiveness, has not been good for the Palestinian people. Not the anti-Israel cause as it has existed.
Why not? They would say, well, now we have all these allies around the world who are fighting our corner. Why is that obsessive hatred against Israel not beneficial?
The best thing that can happen to the Palestinians is to reduce the conflict with Israel from a cosmic conflict against an essential evil to a territorial dispute that can be negotiated by two parties.
And so when we see people on Western campuses chanting from the river to the sea, there is sovereign, recognized Israel in the middle. You see this as essentially encouraging them to see the conflict in these terms of cosmic good against evil that traps them in that cycle? Am I understanding that right?
I'm not concerned with the specific slogan itself, but when the campaign is obsessed with dismantling Israel as some kind of criminal state, undoing some horrific cosmic crime of 1948, that's a disaster. Look, let's put it in specific terms.
Yeah.
In 1993, Israel and the PLO came to an agreement on
the Oslo Accords, which was supposed to be an interim agreement towards a permanent peace agreement.
That's right. And over 7 years, and particularly over the first years of the Oslo agreements, there was a series of staged withdrawals and the trappings of some kind of statehood for the Palestinians in the West Bank.
As for the first time, they were given self-government following the withdrawal of Israeli forces from the center of Palestinian towns.
Some of this was symbolic. There were passports, there were stamps. Some of it was not symbolic. There was armed forces. There was an international airport opened in Gaza. And already in those years, an enormous amount of energy that should have gone to state building went into suicide terrorism. Suicide bombings in Israel
the suicide bombings in the Second Intifada. I mean, they came before as well, but they didn't come out of nowhere, right? This was a product of many years of investment.
So already then, the state building effort was being hobbled, and then at the moment of truth, when there was an opportunity to sign a final status agreement that would have created the first Palestinian state
Camp David in 2000.
Yes, with a presence in East Jerusalem, with a presence in holy sites, with a full Arab sovereignty in Palestine. That was turned down, and what happened instead was the suicidal terrorism of the Second Intifada. Now, the fact that leaders of a nation or of a political cause make bad decisions is not in and of itself unique or interesting.
The question is whether one learns from them.
It's not just, that's an interesting question, but here's a question that bothers me, was there even a minority opposed to this? Because I've never seen any military action in Israel that didn't have at least a group of protesters out here across the street from where we are.
Which is a jolly good thing, because it's that sort of internal argument and dissent that keeps democracies healthy and lively and on their feet.
At the time, there was no dissent to this decision.
Within Palestinian society.
Within Palestine, within the Arab world at large, and within the pro-Palestinian community among Western academics. But not just was there no dissent in 2000, in 2001, as
Let's
this was
take this forward to 2023.
20 years on, when the price of that decision is known, when the catastrophe of that decision is obvious.
Because let's remind listeners, the suicide bombings of the Second Intifada were followed by Israel retaking the towns in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria that they had evacuated just a few years earlier, reversing many of what the Palestinians saw as their gains from the Oslo.
That's right. And 20 years on, even today, there is no dissenting voice. Not within Palestinian politics.
No dissenting voice. There must be people who understand this was a disaster and blowing up buses in Tel Aviv was probably a mistake.
Well, Abbas says taking the Second Intifada to a position of violence and suicidal terrorism was a mistake. He's never spoken out against the refusal to accept the proposals, not at Camp David, not at Taba, and he himself refused even more generous proposals coming later at Annapolis. And in his negotiations with
that perhaps in hindsight, suffering in the last 20 years could have been avoided if that peace agreement had been accepted.
To make that claim is to voluntarily leave the community of pro-Palestinian intellectuals and speakers. And
so let's take
writers.
this up to 2023 and the October 7 massacre. What are you seeing within the intellectual circles? And since then, again, we take the question of literally what did they think was going to happen as a result of October 7th. But when you see the polls saying that the overwhelming majority of Palestinians, West Bank, Gaza, think that the October 7 attacks were the correct decision despite everything that has happened, where are the voices saying, guys, this is insane, obviously there was a horrific mistake, and we're all paying a very heavy price for this war that Hamas has decided to reign on Gaza? Where are these voices?
There have been a few, very, very few.
Why?
There have been a few, and they've come not from the places where they should be coming from. They have not come from human rights organizations. They have not come from international peace groups. They have not come from...
Because this is astonishing, and I find this as well with the protests that are taking place around the world, and I very firmly call them pro-Hamas marches, and people will push back and say, these are pro-Palestinian marches. I say, no, if you genuinely cared about the Palestinians, you would say, these psychopaths of Hamas have brought disaster on the people of Gaza. They should surrender, return the hostages, lay down their arms, turn over their paedophile, rapist, war criminals for a war crimes tribunal. And instead, these people are chanting for a ceasefire that would leave Hamas in power, which doesn't suggest any sort of accountability, including from the human rights organizations you would expect to be the first ones to denounce the genocidal terrorists of Hamas.
Because I think what's motivating them is not a particular affinity for the Palestinian people, and it's not a principled love for Hamas or a principled opposition to the conditions that you raised, or a principled desire for ceasefire. There's a third thing here, which is they believe that that's bad for Israel.
But what's bad for Israel?
Keeping Hamas in power.
And therefore they want Hamas in power because it is bad for Israel?
I think the October 7th massacre, in all of its gory intimacy, didn't just spark a jubilation there. I think there was something that was thrilling about it.
It was exhilarating, as we saw from that awful professor at Cornell.
For haters of Israel.
What did they find so exhilarating about it? And again, we're quoting not a Palestinian, we're talking about an American academic at Cornell in the immediate days after the massacre, joining what you call that sense of jubilation and celebration. What was exhilarating for them? How?
He comes from a milieu where hatred of Israel is not an emergent property of other ideological commitments, but an organizing principle of a comprehensive ideological worldview.
So you're saying it's not that they have this ideology and hatred of Israel as some sort of outgrowth of it. It's somehow the core of what is this ideology that you are identifying? Yes, the idea
that there is a people apart who rejected a vision of peace and universal brotherhood. And
people apart who do not recognize you. You're quoting the book of Esther at me.
Yes, but not just. Who rejected a universal message of peace, who stand in the way of brotherhood and goodness, and who therefore...
These people being the Jews?
Well, yes.
Sorry, the Israelis.
Yeah.
Right, got it.
And who therefore deserve whatever hatred they get, has deep theological roots.
And so we're witnessing this sense of jubilation and excitement around the world and the failure of human rights organizations to hold Hamas to account. By the way, in stark contrast to what we're seeing from governmental levels, the European Parliament voting recently, essentially in support of Israel's war goals of destroying Hamas and bringing back the hostages, when they said there should be no permanent ceasefire until the hostages are returned and Hamas is dismantled. But that's not the same in the ideological movements. And so I want to ask you, we've been talking a lot about the need for de-radicalization the day after Hamas. That's going to take time for the day after Hamas, but once Hamas is out of the scene, we think it's important that we create not only security for people in Israel, but also new opportunities for Palestinians who, the soundbite is, they understand that terrorism is a dead end and there's no light at the end of that tunnel. And as part of that de-radicalization, we don't want to see schools continuing to educate towards jihad and martyrdom. We don't want to see any of the child soldier boot camps that have brutalized the children of Gaza and created the current generation of terrorists. But it sounds like there's also a much deeper narrative or mode of thinking that's going to have to be tackled. And I'm wondering, do you see any forces internationally at the level of the UN, human rights organizations, that will help with this process of de-radicalization in order to steer the Palestinians towards a narrative that does involve taking responsibility and accountability and learning lessons? Or are we just going to slip into this same cycle that condemns them and us to more violence and misery?
I don't think that there's anything, I don't think any of that de-radicalization can or will come from Israel. I think we're very limited in what we can do there. We've also been, and it's very important to say, we've been very clear that we have no intention to permanently reoccupy Gaza. We will destroy Hamas. We will demilitarize the Gaza Strip, and the Prime Minister has made his point about needing full security control, because we are the only ones who will be able to ensure Gaza's demilitarization. But it's not like the Allies in Germany after the Second World War. We're going to be on the ground or actually running these schools. It is going to have to be the international community that takes seriously the work of de-radicalization. So you're asking me, can this kind of thing happen again? And I'll say this: if it does, if this cycle is repeated in another 20 years, I won't be surprised. I do think we can stop it.
And how do we stop it?
Well, so there's some interesting things. Whenever we talk about Israel in the region, we talk about this insane demand for normalization. That word says so much, and the way we've accepted...
Normalization, you mean the trend of the Abraham Accords and closer relations with Bahrain, UAE?
Arab states recognize Israel and
you don't like the word normalization?
I think the fact that we use it and think that it's such a big treat for Israel, that it's something Israel has to earn, really gives the game away.
I don't think it's something we need to earn. I think it's something we deserve.
I agree with you. I think the thing that needs to concern us is the status quo, which is the abnormalization of Israel. The fact that so many, that our neighbors have organized their politics for almost a century now around hating Israel, around hating the Jews in the Middle East, is the thing that needs to be tackled. And the indulgence that that's received from the international community, from Israelis in a certain sense.
Why do you say indulgence? Because what I hear from the international community is they think that the normalization process is excellent. They see new opportunities for partnerships and economic trade, etc., and they want to encourage that.
The abnormalization of Israel has been indulged for 75 years.
That it's taken for granted that this is the default mode. It's taken for granted
that Arabs should hate Israel, that Arab states should boycott Israel. If you're a citizen of a Western country and you need to do business in the Middle East, you can ask your government for a second passport, so heaven forbid you don't enter.
And this connects to what we were saying at the beginning about becoming used to an abnormal reality and forgetting how outrageous and totally messed up it is.
But there are institutional ramifications to this too, and I think they'll be relevant in Gaza in the post-war situation. The biggest one, of course, is UNRWA.
Let's remind that there are 2 UN refugee agencies in the world, one for the Palestinians, one for everyone else, and they have very different mandates, because if you or I, God forbid, were to become refugees, as soon as we get another citizenship or residency, we're no longer refugees. But the mandate of the UNRWA agency is to perpetuate the Palestinian refugee issue by giving them that status down the generations, even if they have a green card, even if they have citizenship somewhere else, even if they are, by their own admission, Palestinians living in sovereign Palestinian territory as they see it within the West Bank.
Right, or Gaza. Right now, most of Gaza's population is registered as refugees. These are Palestinians living in Palestine under a Palestinian government. And
you see the need as part of the push towards de-radicalization? How does that fit in?
Absolutely. Humanitarian aid should go to governing authorities if there's a need for humanitarian aid.
Well, the governing authorities in Gaza are Hamas at the moment.
Well, the world, if the world does not want to fund Hamas, it doesn't need to fund Hamas. But there's no reason for it to be funding Hamas through the back door, not only funding Hamas radicalization, but giving a UN imprimatur to a demand that does not exist in international law or in any international precedent for the so-called right of return.
Because we say that not only Israel is held by double standards, it turns out the Palestinians also have double standards applied to them with this different status of refugee that is prolonging the conflict. But what specifically do you see being the link to de-radicalization?
So again, if we can build an international structure that that no longer promotes this kind of irredentism, and widen the circle of Arab-Israeli normalization to a point where we've taken out what I call the cosmic sting of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's not an existential one, but it's a territorial dispute, that can be solved. Actually, the gaps between the Israeli and Palestinian maps on two states are not very big. And it doesn't take a huge amount of creativity. Yeah, there's some complicated issues. There's Jerusalem. There's issues about settlements. There's all sorts of weird places on the map. They're not weirder than arrangements that have been drawn between European countries after war, to say nothing of countries in Asia and Africa.
And these are
solvable. These are solvable problems. What is not a solvable problem is the belief that the existence of a Jewish state anywhere in the Middle East is a crime and has to be eliminated.
Shany, when this war is over, and we all hope that it's going to be over soon, but it's going to take time. Well, time is running out for the hostages, but certainly to destroy Hamas and dismantle it. We in Israel are going to be asking ourselves a lot of very difficult questions, a lot of accountability and responsibility and learning lessons so that we can prepare ourselves and make sure that an attack like this can never happen again. How optimistic are you that on the Palestinian side, there will be a similar process of learning lessons and people taking responsibility and accountability for what happened?
Again, I'm not in a position to make that kind of judgment.
As a historian, having looked at this same pattern recurring throughout history, do you see any signs of breaking that pattern, or do you think we're sleepwalking into the same pattern of disaster again?
So let's take your question in multiple parts. I am not fully convinced that even we on the Israeli side are capable of doing that yet. I hope we are. I see lots of ways that can go wrong. In terms of the Palestinians, the problem is not with the Palestinians themselves as a people. I think what ails the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people on the dimension that you raise is the way that its cause has been folded into the larger Arab-Israeli conflict and at various points into global political fissures, whether it was the battle between the anti-fascist coalition of democracies and communist states against the Nazis and their allies, whether it was the Cold War battle, whether it was the fissure at the beginning of the current century between jihadism and the
that
liberal regimes.
Linkage will remain.
I think that's not something that we can control. I'm not even sure it's something that the Palestinians themselves can control. As long as the struggle against the existence of a Jewish state retains this kind of passionate devotion, it's very, very hard to see how that cycle breaks. And it's demanding a lot of the Palestinians on their own to decide that they're going to break it as some sort of lesson learning exercise from repeated defeat and conflict.
And places a lot of responsibility, therefore, on international actors and foreign societies as well to help disconnect the Palestinian question from these broader questions.
That's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. And that needs to be manifest in, like I said, in diplomatic initiatives from the major global powers, in
diplomatic initiatives that would do what?
Initiatives that would create the conditions for a Palestinian self-government that is not dedicated to eliminating Israel and not dedicated to, for example, things like the right of return. I think that
which is, of course, the major fear within Israel when people raise the spectre of a Palestinian state, the widespread fear that that would not, in fact, end the conflict, but fuel more of it by creating a staging ground for people who are ideologically convinced to destroying Israel and have, unfortunately, used extreme violence.
And a staging ground for future massacres as well. As we've seen in the last 2 decades, and even possibly more, every bit of land that Israel has vacated, whether it was in an interim agreement, in a peace agreement, or unilaterally, has become a base for jihadist violence against Israelis.
Yeah. We're seared by experience.
Whenever Israel leaves that territory, there's lots of big statements about how we will respond forcefully to any provocation that happens from there, and lots of assumptions about global support for this to happen. And when it actually does happen, we always find that there's several considerations blocking us from doing it, an enormous amount of global pressure. We get to a point, as we did in the West Bank in 2002, as we did in Gaza in 2023, when we are finally forced to respond militarily to what we should have responded to way before, the cost is higher both for us and for the other side. And there has to be a lesson for the international system there too.
And this is perhaps the tragedy of October 7th, that this war happened perhaps because for so long Israel had tried to avoid a big final confrontation
and was condemned
with
for
Hamas.
the means that it employed. Having a blockade was instead of a kinetic military operation.
Because this was a try to find a way to live next to the Hamas terror regime instead of doing what perhaps we should have done, which is to go in and dismantle it.
And convincing ourselves that we can tolerate a certain minimal amount of rocket fire for 17 years, or actually for 22
what they call
years.
in Hebrew a drip, a tiftuf of rocket fire.
Was a colossal mistake. The international community has to be clear right now. You want Israel to leave a piece of territory? If we're leaving that territory, it has to be understood, regardless of whatever de-radicalization you do or don't do, because that's Israel. Israel is not going to do it. A rocket that's fired from there, a suicide bombing that comes from there, an infiltration that comes from there into a kibbutz or a moshav will be met with enormous force, and that has to be clear from the outset.
Tragically, Shany, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7 massacre, it was clear to everyone that Israel had a firm right, in fact, a duty to respond through military means in order to prevent the October 7 massacre from happening again. And I hope that in the wake of this war, after we win this war, we'll see that lessons learned process, not only inside Israel, we'll have accountability to do of our own, not only among Palestinians so we can escape this cycle of ecstasy and amnesia, as you call it, but also within international community, and think about how some of those foreign policy orthodoxies that everyone says are obvious have in fact done tremendous damage in sustaining the conflict. Shany Mor, it was a pleasure hosting this podcast with you. I could say almost an ecstatic experience, and I'm sure that as for Amnesia, it's not a podcast episode that anyone will forget. Shany Mor, thank you very much for coming on State of a Nation.
Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode of State of a Nation. Please follow on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back soon with the next episode. Thank you very much.